Sarah Chun had exactly 37 seconds to decide whether to tell the truth about the scar on her spine, and those 37 seconds would determine whether she kept her job as head nurse at Riverside Elementary or walked away from the only life she'd built after leaving the Army. The school board meeting was already running late, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry wasps, and Principal Davies was shuffling through a stack of papers with the kind of methodical precision that meant someone was about to get fired. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the familiar weight of judgment settling over the room like morning fog. She'd been called to this emergency session without explanation, pulled from her duties, treating scraped knees and checking temperatures, but she could read the signs. The way Superintendent Rodriguez avoided eye contact. The way school board member Patricia Wells kept glancing at her phone, probably checking social media for more ammunition. The way Davies cleared his throat before speaking, that particular sound administrators made when they were about to destroy someone's career with bureaucratic language. The trouble had started 3 weeks ago when a new parent, Marcus Sterling, had complained about Sarah's unprofessional conduct during his son's asthma attack. What Sterling called unprofessional, Sarah called life-saving. When 8-year-old Tyler had collapsed during recess, his inhaler nowhere to be found, Sarah had acted with the same decisive authority that had once made her the most feared sniper in her unit. She'd positioned Tyler's body to maximize airflow, administered emergency medication from her locked cabinet, and coordinated with paramedics while simultaneously keeping 20 panicked children calm and organized. Tyler had walked out of the hospital the same day, breathing normally, his frightened parents thanking Sarah through tears of relief. But Marcus Sterling hadn't seen a dedicated nurse saving his nephew's life. He'd seen a woman barking orders, like a drill sergeant, moving with what he described as military aggression, and treating his family's medical emergency like a combat situation. Sterling had filed a formal complaint, demanding Sarah's removal and citing her military background as evidence that she was psychologically unfit to work with children. He'd somehow obtained copies of her Army records, documents that detailed her service as a reconnaissance sniper, and had shared them on the school's Facebook page with commentary about how trained killers didn't belong in elementary schools. The post had gone viral in their small Connecticut town. Parents who had never questioned Sarah's gentle bedside manner or her ability to calm their frightened children suddenly saw her through Sterling's lens. The woman who had organized the school's annual health fair, who stayed late to train teachers in CPR, who had never missed a day of work in her 4 years at Riverside, was now being painted as a dangerous veteran who couldn't separate her military training from civilian life. Sarah thought about the morning she'd first walked into Riverside Elementary, fresh from her medical discharge and carrying nothing but a nursing degree earned through night classes and a desperate need to find purpose outside the military. She'd been 28 years old, wearing a carefully pressed blouse and skirt, her hair pulled back in a style she hoped looked professional rather than regulation. The principal then, Mrs. Henderson, had hired her on the spot after learning about her emergency medical training and her experience treating trauma injuries in field conditions. Henderson had seen Sarah's military background as an asset, not a liability. But Henderson had retired 2 years ago, and Davies had a different philosophy about personnel management. He preferred nurses who fit a particular mold, women who spoke softly and wore cardigans and never made parents uncomfortable by demonstrating too much competence under pressure. Sarah's direct communication style and her tendency to take charge during medical emergencies had made him nervous from the beginning. He'd been looking for a reason to replace her with someone more traditional, someone who wouldn't make school board meetings complicated. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her ability to save lives was being used as evidence that she was dangerous. In Afghanistan, her precision with a rifle had protected convoys and prevented ambushes. Her confirmed kills, a number that haunted her dreams but had kept dozens of soldiers alive, were now being twisted into proof that she was unsuitable to bandage scraped knees and check for head lice. The same steady hands that had once held a scope steady at impossible distances now trembled slightly as she waited for Davies to deliver whatever verdict the board had reached. The silence in the conference room stretched until it became uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of children playing outside during afternoon recess. Sarah could hear their laughter through the closed windows, the sound of the life she was about to lose. She thought about Emma Rodriguez, the third grader with type 1 diabetes who depended on Sarah's careful monitoring of her blood sugar levels. She thought about Marcus Thompson, the kindergartner with severe allergies whose EpiPen Sarah had administered twice this year, saving his life both times. She thought about the dozen children who visited her office every day, not because they were sick, but because they needed someone to listen, someone who made them feel safe. Principal Davies finally looked up from his papers, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant bad news was coming. Sarah had seen that look before, on the faces of commanding officers who were about to deliver orders that would send soldiers into harm's way. The difference was that those officers had respected her abilities even as they asked her to risk everything. Davies just wanted her gone. "Miss Chen," Davies began, his voice carrying the formal tone of official business, "the school board has reviewed the complaint filed by Mr. Sterling, as well as the public response to the information that has been shared about your military service." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "While we appreciate your 4 years of service to our school community, we have concerns about whether your background is compatible with our educational environment." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was how it started. The careful language that would lead to her dismissal. She'd seen other veterans go through this process, watched as their service was transformed from an asset into a liability by people who had never faced real danger, never had to make split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. Superintendent Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Sarah, no one questions your medical competence or your dedication to the children. Your record here has been exemplary. But we have to consider the community's comfort level, especially given the recent publicity surrounding your military background." The phrase "community's comfort level" hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about the hundreds of parents who had shaken her hand at school events, who had sought her advice about their children's health concerns, who had trusted her with their most precious possessions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How many of them had known about her military service and simply not cared because she was good at her job? How many had now been swayed by Sterling's campaign to paint her as a threat? Board member Patricia Wells spoke up, her voice pitched, in the particular register of someone who considered herself reasonable while saying unreasonable things. "Miss Chun, perhaps you could help us understand. When you were in the military, your role involved. Well, Mr. Sterling has shared some very specific information about your service record." Sarah knew what Wells wanted her to say. She wanted Sarah to downplay her military service, to minimize her role, to apologize for the skills that had once made her invaluable to her country. She wanted Sarah to transform herself into someone unthreatening, someone who could be dismissed without controversy. "I served as a reconnaissance sniper," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "I was deployed twice to Afghanistan, where my unit was responsible for force protection and intelligence gathering." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah could see the board members exchanging glances, their discomfort obvious. They had wanted her to lie or deflect, to give them an excuse to keep her while pretending her service hadn't been what it was. Her honesty had trapped them in their own prejudices. Davies cleared his throat again, the sound sharper this time. "Miss Chun, I think we all understand that military service involves difficult decisions. But surely you can see how parents might be concerned about having someone with your particular background working so closely with their children." Sarah thought about Tyler Sterling, the boy whose life she'd saved 3 weeks ago. She thought about how his parents had hugged her, tears streaming down their faces, promising they would never forget what she'd done. She wondered if they knew what their brother-in-law was doing to her now, if they would speak up for her, or if they would stay silent to avoid family conflict. "My particular background," Sarah repeated, tasting the euphemism. "You mean my ability to remain calm under pressure? My training in emergency medicine? My experience treating trauma injuries in field conditions?" The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Sarah realized she had crossed some invisible line, that her directness was being interpreted as aggression. In the military, speaking clearly and without equivocation had been a virtue. In this room, it made her dangerous. Board member James Harrison, who had been silent until now, leaned back in his chair with an expression Sarah recognized from her military days. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind and was just going through the motions of due process. "Ms. Chun, no one is questioning your patriotism or your service to our country. But we have to ask ourselves whether someone trained to kill is the right fit for an elementary school environment." The words "trained to kill" seemed to echo in the small room. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, felt the familiar surge of anger that came when civilians reduced her military service to its most basic elements while ignoring everything else she had learned and done. Yes, she had been trained to kill. She had also been trained to save lives, to think strategically under pressure, to lead others through impossible situations, to remain calm when everything around her was falling apart. "Mr. Harrison," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled, "I was also trained in combat medicine, trauma response, leadership under pressure, and crisis management. Those skills have served the children of this school well over the past 4 years." Harrison's expression didn't change. "Nevertheless, the optics are challenging. Mr. Sterling has raised legitimate concerns about whether parents should be comfortable leaving their children in the care of someone with your military specialization." Sarah realized that Harrison had probably never spoken to Sterling directly, had probably formed his opinion based on Facebook posts and gossip. The idea that a man who had never met her, who knew nothing about her character or her work, could destroy her career with social media posts and inflammatory language made her feel sick. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but Sarah could tell the decision had already been made. The board members asked carefully worded questions, designed to give them cover, seeking quotes they could use to justify their predetermined conclusion. They wanted her to resign voluntarily, to save them the trouble of firing her and the bad publicity that might come with dismissing a veteran. When Davies finally dismissed her, telling her they would be in touch with their decision within the week, Sarah walked out of the building she had called home for 4 years, knowing she would never return as an employee. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and she could hear children laughing on the playground, the sound following her to her car like an echo of everything she was about to lose. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment going through boxes of memorabilia she hadn't looked at in years. Her military awards were packed away in a storage container, along with photographs from her deployments and letters from soldiers, whose lives she had saved with her precision and her courage. She had hidden these reminders of her service when she started working at the school, worried that parents might find them intimidating. Now she wondered if hiding them had been a mistake, if owning her past might have prevented Sterling from weaponizing it against her. She found her discharge papers, the official documentation of her medical retirement after a roadside bomb had damaged her spine and ended her military career. The doctors had told her she would never walk normally again. that the shrapnel embedded near her vertebrae would limit her mobility permanently. They had been wrong about that, as they had been wrong about many things. Sarah had spent 2 years in physical therapy, pushing herself through pain that would have broken most people, determined to rebuild her life around something meaningful. Nursing had given her that meaning. Working with children had shown her a different way to serve, a way to use her skills to heal rather than harm. She had thought she had found her place in the world, a role where her military training was an asset rather than a burden. Now she was discovering that some people would never see past the uniform she had once worn, would never trust her to be anything other than what she had been in combat. The phone rang as she was putting the boxes away. The caller ID showed Dr. Amanda Foster, the pediatrician who worked closely with the school district and had become something of a friend over the years. Sarah almost didn't answer, not ready to hear sympathy or advice about her situation. "Sarah," Amanda said without preamble, "I heard about the board meeting. This is insane." Sarah sank into her couch, suddenly exhausted. "Amanda, I can't talk about this right now." "Listen to me," Amanda continued, her voice urgent. "I've worked with dozens of school nurses over the years, and you're the best I've ever seen. The way you handled that meningitis scare last year, the protocol you developed for managing diabetic students, your response to Tyler's asthma attack, you're exceptional at this job." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "It doesn't matter how good I am if parents don't trust me with their children." "One parent," Amanda corrected firmly. "One parent with an agenda who managed to whip up hysteria on social media. Sarah, most of the parents I talk to think you walk on water. They just haven't been as vocal as Sterling." After Amanda hung up, Sarah spent the evening researching Marcus Sterling, trying to understand what had motivated his campaign against her. What she found made her stomach turn. Sterling was a local businessman who had been involved in several controversies over the years, including a lawsuit against the town over zoning decisions and a public dispute with his neighbors over property lines. He seemed to thrive on conflict, on positioning himself as a defender of community values against various perceived threats. Sarah realized she had become Sterling's latest cause, a convenient target for his need to be seen as a protector. Her military service had given him the perfect weapon, a way to paint himself as defending innocent children against a dangerous outsider. The fact that she had saved his nephew's life was irrelevant to his narrative. If anything, it made her more threatening because it demonstrated the very competence that made his claim seem absurd. The next morning, Sarah arrived at school to find her access card had been deactivated. She stood in the parking lot, watching teachers and staff enter the building she could no longer access, feeling like a stranger in a place that had been her second home. Davies had moved quickly, clearly eager to avoid any confrontation or scenes that might complicate the board's decision. Mrs. Patterson, the third-grade teacher whose classroom was next to the nurse's office, spotted Sarah through the window and came outside. Her expression was troubled, and she kept glancing around as if worried about being seen talking to Sarah. "This is wrong," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Everyone knows this is wrong. You saved Tyler's life, and now they're treating you like a criminal." Sarah appreciated the support, but she could see the fear in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. The teacher was worried about her own job, worried about being associated with controversy. Sarah didn't blame her for that fear. In small communities, careers could be destroyed by association, and speaking up for unpopular positions carried real risks. "Take care of the kids," Sarah said simply. "That's all that matters." As she drove away from Riverside Elementary for what might be the last time, Sarah passed the playground where children were arriving for the school day. She saw Emma Rodriguez getting out of her mother's car, the little girl with diabetes who would need her blood sugar monitored twice during the day. She saw Marcus Thompson walking toward the building with his backpack and his EpiPen, the boy with severe allergies who counted on Sarah to keep him safe. She saw dozens of other children whose minor injuries and major fears she had treated with equal care and attention. These were the children Sterling claimed she was too dangerous to help. These were the lives the school board was willing to gamble with rather than defend a nurse whose only crime was being too competent, too direct, too unwilling to apologize for the skills that made her exceptional at her job. Sarah drove home through the Connecticut countryside, past farms and forests that had welcomed her when she first moved here after her discharge. She had thought this place would be different from the military, that civilian life would judge her on her actions rather than her past. She had been naive about many things, but mostly about the fear that competent women inspired in people who preferred their caretakers to be unthreatening and deferential. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls from reporters who had picked up the story, messages from veterans organizations offering support, and letters from parents she had never met expressing opinions about her fitness to work with children. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about the controversy, interviewing school board members who spoke in careful euphemisms about community standards and appropriate backgrounds for educational professionals. Sarah found herself becoming a symbol in a debate she had never wanted to be part of. Veterans groups rallied to her defense, arguing that her military service should be seen as an asset rather than a liability. Parent groups split along predictable lines, with some demanding her immediate dismissal and others pointing to her record of excellent care. The story was picked up by national media, transforming a local personnel decision into a broader conversation about how society treats military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Through it all, Sarah remained largely silent, following the advice of the lawyer she had hired to represent her interests. She wanted to defend herself, to explain how her military training had made her a better nurse, not a dangerous one. But every public statement carried risks. Every interview could be edited to support whatever narrative the outlet preferred. She had learned in military that sometimes the best strategy was to let others reveal their true nature while maintaining your own dignity. The school board's final meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the high school auditorium, a larger venue chosen to accommodate the public interest in the case. Sarah arrived early, wearing the same professional outfit she had worn to her original job interview 4 years earlier. She wanted to look like the dedicated nurse she was, not the dangerous veteran Sterling had painted her to be. The auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, community members, and reporters filling every seat. Sarah recognized many faces. From school events and parent conferences, people who had trusted her with their children's health and safety. Some avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the controversy. Others nodded supportively or offered small smiles of encouragement. Sterling was there, of course, sitting in the front row with a small group of supporters. He had clearly prepared for this moment, wearing a suit and tie that made him look like a concerned parent rather than the architect of a smear campaign. His wife sat beside him, looking uncomfortable with the attention her husband's crusade had generated. The meeting began with Davies reading a prepared statement about the board's deliberations and their commitment to making decisions in the best interests of the children. He spoke in the bureaucratic language of institutional self-protection, emphasizing the board's careful consideration of all factors and their respect for diverse viewpoints. When he finally reached the decision, his words were anticlimactic in their simplicity. After careful deliberation, the board has decided to terminate Ms. Chin's employment, effective immediately. We will be posting the position and beginning a search for her replacement as soon as possible. The auditorium erupted in a mixture of applause and boos, parents and community members making their feelings known. Sarah sat quietly through the noise, feeling strangely detached from the scene. She had expected this outcome, had prepared herself for it, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. What happened next would change everything. As Davies called for order and prepared to move on to other business, a voice from The back of the auditorium cut through the noise like a knife. "Point of order, Mr. Davies. I have some information the board needs to hear before this decision becomes final." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Standing at the back of the auditorium was a woman Sarah didn't recognize. Someone in her 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. She was walking down the center aisle with purposeful strides, carrying herself with an authority that made the room gradually fall silent. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She had no idea who this woman was or what information she might have, but something about her presence suggested that the evening was far from over. The woman reached the front of the auditorium and turned to address both the board and the audience, her voice carrying clearly through the space without any need for amplification. "My name is Colonel Patricia Webb, United States Army, retired. I served as Miss Chin's commanding officer during her second deployment to Afghanistan. I've been following the situation with great interest, and I believe there are some facts the board should consider before making their final decision." The auditorium was completely silent now, everyone straining to hear what Colonel Webb had to say. Even Sterling seemed caught off guard, his confident expression replaced by uncertainty. Sarah stared at her former commanding officer, amazed that Webb had tracked down this story and traveled here to speak on her behalf. Davies looked flustered, clearly not prepared for this development. "Colonel Webb, while we appreciate your perspective, the board has already reached its decision based on the information available to us." Colonel Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Mr. Davies, I don't think you understand the full scope of the information available to you. May I address the board and this community about the real record of Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun?" The emphasis on Sarah's military rank sent a ripple through the audience. Many of them had probably never known her rank or the respect it commanded. They had seen her only as a nurse, not as a soldier who had earned her stripes through exceptional service under impossible conditions. Sarah's hands were shaking now, though whether from fear or anticipation she couldn't tell. Her military service was about to be examined in detail, but this time by someone who understood what it really meant, someone who could explain the true nature of her contributions rather than reducing them to inflammatory sound bites. Colonel Webb didn't wait for Davies's permission. She turned to address the audience directly, her voice carrying the authority of decades of military leadership. What she said next would transform not just how the community saw Sarah Chun, but how they understood the meaning of service itself. The reckoning had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. Colonel Webb stepped closer to the microphone at the front of the auditorium, her presence commanding attention from every person in the room. The silver stars on her lapel caught the harsh fluorescent light, and Sarah noticed that several veterans in the audience had unconsciously straightened in their seats, responding to the authority that Webb carried like a second skin. Even Sterling seemed to shrink back slightly, perhaps beginning to realize that his carefully orchestrated campaign was about to face scrutiny from someone who actually understood military service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to briefing generals and congressional committees. "You've been told that Sarah Chun is dangerous because she was a sniper. You've been told that her military training makes her unsuitable to work with children. You've been told that parents should fear leaving their children in her care." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the packed auditorium. "What you haven't been told is the truth about what Staff Sergeant Chun actually did during her 8 years of service to this country." Davies tried to interrupt, clearly uncomfortable with losing control of the meeting. "Colonel Webb, while we respect your service and your perspective, the board has procedures for public comment that require advance registration." Webb turned to look at Davies with an expression that made several people in the front row visibly wince. Sarah had seen that look before, usually directed at junior officers who had made the mistake of questioning Webb's authority during mission briefings. "Mr. Davies, I've spent the last 3 days reviewing public records related to this case. I've read Mr. Sterling's social media posts, your board's statements to the press, and the various news articles that have portrayed Staff Sergeant Chen as some kind of unstable veteran who poses a threat to children. Her voice grew harder. What I haven't seen is a single accurate description of her actual service record or the circumstances that led to her medical retirement. The phrase medical retirement seemed to hang in the air, and Sarah saw several audience members exchange glances. Sterling had been careful to avoid mentioning the circumstances of Sarah's discharge, focusing instead on her role as a sniper and the number of confirmed kills attributed to her unit. He had painted her as someone who had chosen to leave the military, not someone who had been forced out by injuries sustained in service to her country. Sterling stood up from his seat in the front row, his confidence returning as he prepared to challenge Webb's testimony. Colonel, with all due respect, Ms. Chun's medical issues don't change the fact that she was trained as a killer. Parents have a right to know who's working with their children. Webb's smile was sharp as a blade. Mr. Sterling, you're absolutely right that parents have a right to know who's working with their children. They should know that Staff Sergeant Chun saved more lives during her military service than most people save in a lifetime. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. They should know about the convoy of civilians she protected during the evacuation of Kandahar, using her skills to neutralize threats from over a mile away without firing a single shot that endangered innocent lives. The auditorium was completely silent now, the kind of deep quiet that comes when people realize they're about to hear something that will change their understanding of everything. Sarah felt her heart pounding as Webb continued, revealing details of her service that she had never shared with anyone in her civilian life. They should know about the medical training she completed during her second deployment, when she volunteered to serve as backup medic for her unit because she was determined to save lives as well as protect them. Webb's voice grew stronger, more passionate. They should know that on March 15, 2018, Staff Sergeant Chun crawled through enemy fire to reach 2 wounded soldiers, providing emergency medical care that kept them alive until medevac could arrive, all while maintaining defensive positions that protected the entire rescue operation. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that day with painful clarity. The roadside bomb had overturned their vehicle, leaving Corporal Martinez and Private Johnson trapped and bleeding while enemy fire pinned down the rest of the unit. Sarah had made the decision to move, using her knowledge of the terrain and her training in tactical medicine to reach the wounded soldiers. She had spent 40 minutes in the open, treating sucking chest wounds and applying tourniquets while coordinating with air support to clear the area for extraction. Mr. Sterling, Webb continued, her voice now carrying an edge that made several people in the front row shift uncomfortably. You've focused a great deal of attention on Staff Sergeant Chun's confirmed kills, suggesting that this number makes her dangerous to children. What you haven't mentioned is that every single one of those kills was made in defense of American soldiers or innocent civilians. What you haven't mentioned is that her precision and her restraint saved countless lives by eliminating threats without causing collateral damage. Sterling's face was flushed now, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to crumble under Webb's systematic dismantling of his arguments. Colonel, I understand that military service is honorable, but surely you can see the difference between combat situations and working with elementary school children. Webb nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, Mr. Sterling. There is a tremendous difference. In combat, Staff Sergeant Chun had seconds to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for multiple people. In a school setting, she has had years to demonstrate her ability to apply those same decision-making skills to medical emergencies involving children. She turned to address the broader audience. How many of you know that Sarah Chun has completed more continuing education hours than any other school nurse in this district? How many of you know that she's trained in pediatric advanced life support, disaster response, and crisis intervention, specifically designed for educational settings? A woman in the third row raised her hand tentatively. Sarah recognized her as Mrs. Foster, whose daughter had broken her arm on the playground 2 years ago. Colonel Webb, my daughter Hannah fell off the monkey bars, and Sarah was the one who treated her. She was so calm and gentle, and she explained everything she was doing so Hannah wouldn't be scared. I never thought about her military background. I just knew she was exactly who I wanted taking care of my child when she was hurt and frightened. Other parents began to speak up, sharing their own experiences with Sarah's care. Mr. Thompson, whose son had the severe allergies, stood to address the board directly. My boy is alive because Sarah Chun knew exactly what to do when he went into anaphylactic shock during lunch. She didn't just give him his EpiPen. She positioned his body to improve circulation, monitored his vital signs, and talked him through his panic while we waited for the ambulance. If that's what military training looks like, then I want someone with military training taking care of my kid. Davies was clearly losing control of the meeting, but Webb wasn't finished. She opened her folder and pulled out several official documents, holding them up so the audience could see the military letterhead and official seals. Mr. Davies, since this board has made Staff Sergeant Chun's military record a matter of public discussion, I think the community deserves to know the complete truth about her service. She began reading from what appeared to be an official commendation. For exceptional valor in combat operations, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun distinguished herself through heroic actions that saved the lives of multiple coalition personnel while under intense enemy fire. Her tactical expertise, medical knowledge, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of others exemplify the highest traditions of military service. Webb looked up from the document. This is just one of 6 commendations for valor that Staff Sergeant Chun received during her deployments. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never shared these commendations with anyone in her civilian life, had packed them away with the rest of her military memorabilia because she worried that people would find them intimidating. Now they were being read aloud to a room full of parents and community members who had been told she was too dangerous to bandage their children's scraped knees. Superintendent Rodriguez leaned forward, clearly trying to regain some control over the narrative. Colonel Webb, no one is questioning Ms. Chun's military service or her patriotism. But surely you understand our position. We have to consider community concerns, especially when those concerns involve the safety of children. Webb's expression grew cold. Superintendent Rodriguez, let me tell you about safety. On October 8, 2018, Staff Sergeant Chian's convoy was ambushed by insurgents using roadside bombs and small arms fire. The blast that ended her military career threw her 30 feet from her vehicle and embedded shrapnel in her spine that doctors said would leave her paralyzed from the waist down. The auditorium was completely silent now, every person hanging on Webb's words. Staff Sergeant Chun spent the next 18 months in physical therapy, learning to walk again through sheer force of will and determination that impressed every medical professional who worked with her. Sarah touched her back unconsciously, feeling the familiar ache where the largest piece of shrapnel remained lodged against her vertebrae. The doctors had said removing it would be too risky, that she would have to live with the constant reminder of that October day when everything changed. She had learned to manage the pain, had built her new life around the limitations it imposed, but she had never spoken about it with anyone at the school. It felt too much like asking for sympathy, too much like using her injuries to justify her presence. But here's what really matters to this discussion, Webb continued, her voice growing stronger. While Staff Sergeant Chun was relearning how to walk, she was also completing her nursing degree through online classes and weekend clinicals. She could have accepted a full disability pension and spent the rest of her life as a victim of her service. Instead, she chose to find a new way to serve others, to apply the skills she had learned in combat to healing and helping children. This is the record of someone who has dedicated her entire adult life to protecting and helping others, first as a soldier and now is a nurse. Principal Davies made one last attempt to defend the board's position. "Colonel Webb, we appreciate this additional information, but the decision has already been made. We've conducted a thorough review of the situation and determined that Ms. Chun's employment should be terminated." Webb's expression grew glacial. "Mr. Davies, have you reviewed the legal implications of terminating a disabled veteran based solely on her military service? Have you considered the federal protections that apply to veterans with service-connected disabilities? Have you thought about the message you're sending to other veterans in your community?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Sarah could see Davies beginning to realize the legal minefield he had walked into. Firing a disabled veteran because of her military service, especially when her performance record was exemplary, opened the school district to federal lawsuits that could cost millions of dollars and destroy careers. Superintendent Rodriguez whispered urgently to Davies, clearly trying to find a way out of the corner they had painted themselves into. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as they began to understand the full implications of their decision. But Webb wasn't done. She reached into her briefcase one final time and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Mr. Davies, there's one more thing this community should know about Staff Sergeant Chun's service record." She opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph, holding it up so the audience could see it clearly. The photograph showed Sarah in military fatigues, kneeling beside a hospital bed and reading to a small child. The little girl in the bed was clearly injured, with bandages visible on her arms and head, but she was smiling as Sarah held the book. "This photograph was taken at a field hospital in Kandahar," Webb explained, her voice softer now but still carrying clearly through the auditorium. "Staff Sergeant Chen volunteered her off-duty time to read to Afghan children who were receiving medical treatment at our facility. She learned basic Dari phrases so she could communicate with them, and she spent hundreds of hours providing comfort to children who had been injured in the conflict." Sarah remembered that little girl, Fatima, who had been caught in crossfire and lost her parents in the same attack that wounded her. Sarah had sat with her for hours, reading picture books and practicing English words, trying to provide some small comfort in the midst of unimaginable tragedy. Webb pulled out more photographs, each one showing Sarah interacting with children in various military settings. Sarah teaching a group of Afghan boys how to play baseball using improvised equipment. Sarah helping to distribute supplies at a refugee camp, a toddler perched on her hip while she organized medical supplies. Sarah working alongside civilian doctors to provide vaccinations to children in remote villages. "This is who you're firing," Webb said, her voice now carrying an emotional weight that made several people in the audience wipe their eyes. "This is the woman you've decided is too dangerous to work with American children. Someone who has spent her entire adult life protecting and caring for children, first in war zones and now in peaceful Connecticut classrooms." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of people crying quietly throughout the auditorium. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the public revelation of parts of her service she had kept private for years, but also vindicated in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time since Sterling's campaign began, she felt like people were seeing her as she really was, not as the dangerous caricature that had been painted of her. A young woman in the back of the auditorium stood up, and Sarah recognized her as Jessica Martinez, a teacher at the high school who was also a veteran of the Iraq War. "I served 2 tours in Iraq," Martinez said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet auditorium. "When I came home, I faced some of the same suspicions and fears that Sarah is facing now. People who have never served, who have never faced the kind of impossible choices that military service requires, sometimes can't understand that the same training that makes us capable in combat makes us capable in civilian life." Other veterans throughout the auditorium began to stand, creating a visual representation of the military community that had been largely invisible in the previous discussions. An elderly man near the front identified himself as a Vietnam veteran. A middle-aged woman spoke about her service in the Gulf War, and several younger people shared their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. "We're your neighbors," Martinez continued, her voice growing stronger. "We're your teachers, your nurses, your police officers, your firefighters. We serve this community in dozens of different ways, and we bring the same dedication and expertise to civilian life that we brought to military service." Sarah Chun represents the best of what military training can offer to civilian careers. Sterling made one final attempt to salvage his position, standing up and addressing the board with a voice that had grown noticeably less confident. "I understand that military service is honorable, but my concerns about Ms. Chin's specific background remain valid. Parents have a right to choose who they're comfortable having work with their children." Colonel Webb turned to face Sterling one last time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of her authority and experience. "Mr. Sterling, you're absolutely right that parents have choices. They can choose to trust their children's health and safety to someone who has proven her dedication to protecting and healing others under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Or they can choose to believe social media posts and inflammatory rhetoric over 8 years of exemplary military service and 4 years of outstanding work as a school nurse." She paused, letting her words settle. "But what they can't choose is to destroy the career of a decorated veteran based on fear and prejudice disguised as concern for child safety. What they can't choose is to ignore federal laws protecting veterans from employment discrimination. And what they can't choose is to pretend that Staff Sergeant Chun's military service is anything other than an asset to this school and this community." The board members were huddled in urgent consultation now, clearly realizing that they needed to find a way to reverse their decision without admitting they had been wrong. The legal implications alone were staggering, but the public relations disaster was equally damaging. They had allowed themselves to be manipulated by one person's campaign of fear, and now they were facing the consequences in front of a packed auditorium of constituents. Davies finally stood up, his face pale and his voice shaky. "In light of the additional information presented tonight, the board will need to reconsider our previous decision. We'll be scheduling another meeting to review Ms. Chin's employment status." But Webb wasn't going to let them off that easily. "Mr. Davies, Staff Sergeant Chun has been subjected to 3 weeks of public humiliation and professional destruction based on incomplete and misleading information. Her access to the school has been revoked, her reputation has been damaged, and her ability to serve the children of this community has been compromised. What are you going to do to repair the damage you've caused?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see Davies struggling to find an answer that wouldn't further expose the board to legal liability. The meeting had become a public reckoning, not just for Sarah's case, but for how the community treated its veterans and how decisions were made based on fear rather than facts. As the board members continued their whispered consultations and the audience buzzed with conversation, Sarah sat quietly in her chair, still processing everything that had happened. Colonel Webb had done more than defend her military service. She had revealed the true nature of her character and her contributions in a way that made further opposition seem not just wrong but cruel. The transformation in the room was palpable. Parents who had entered the meeting suspicious or hostile were now looking at her with respect and gratitude. The narrative that had been carefully constructed to paint her as dangerous had been systematically dismantled and replaced with the truth of her service and sacrifice. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The board would have to make a formal decision. Sterling would likely continue his campaign in other forums, and the broader questions about how society treats military veterans would continue to resonate long after this meeting ended. What she didn't know was that Colonel Webb had one final revelation that would change not just her case, but how the entire community understood the meaning of service and sacrifice. The most powerful testimony was yet to come, and when it was delivered, It would leave no doubt about who Sarah Chun really was and what she deserved from the community she had chosen to serve. The board's emergency session 3 days later was held in a much smaller conference room, with only essential personnel present. Sarah arrived wearing her professional attire again, but this time she carried herself differently. The past 72 hours had brought an avalanche of support from unexpected quarters. Letters from parents flooded the district office. Veterans organizations had threatened legal action, and the State Nursing Association had issued a formal statement condemning the board's initial decision. Davies looked haggard as he called the meeting to order, clearly having spent sleepless nights consulting with lawyers and crisis management specialists. The other board members appeared equally worn, their earlier confidence replaced by the grim realization they had created a public relations nightmare with potentially devastating legal consequences. "Miss Chun," Davies began, his voice lacking its previous authority, "the board has reconsidered our decision in light of new information that has come to our attention. We recognize that our initial assessment may have been based on incomplete understanding of your qualifications and background." Sarah remained silent, allowing Davies to continue his carefully worded attempt at damage control. She had learned from Colonel Webb's example that sometimes the most powerful response was to let others reveal their true character through their own words and actions. Superintendent Rodriguez leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they had created. "Sarah, we want to offer you the opportunity to return to your position immediately, with full restoration of your access and privileges. We also want to discuss appropriate compensation for the disruption to your employment." The offer hung in the air, but Sarah could see that this was just the beginning of a more complex negotiation. The board was trying to resolve the situation quietly, hoping to avoid further public scrutiny and potential litigation. But the damage had already been done, and simply restoring her position wouldn't address the broader issues that had been raised. Jacob Martinez, the lawyer Sarah had retained, spoke for the first time. "Gentlemen, my client appreciates the board's reconsideration, but we need to address several concerns before any resolution can be reached. First, there's the matter of the defamatory statements made by board members to the press, suggesting that Ms. Chen was unsuitable for her position based solely on her military service." Davies shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Martinez, the board stands by our right to make personnel decisions based on what we believe to be in the best interests of the students." "That's interesting," Martinez replied, opening a folder filled with legal documents. "Because federal law is quite clear about employment discrimination against veterans, particularly disabled veterans. The Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act prohibits exactly the kind of discrimination my client has experienced." Sarah watched as the board members exchanged worried glances. They had walked into a legal minefield without understanding the federal protections that applied to her situation. Their attempt to appease a vocal parent had exposed them to lawsuits that could cost the district millions of dollars. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, "the public statements made by board members have damaged Ms. Chun's professional reputation in ways that extend far beyond this district. She's received inquiries from other school systems who are now questioning her qualifications based on the publicity surrounding this case." The truth of this statement was evident in the stack of emails Sarah had received over the past week. School districts in neighboring towns had quietly withdrawn offers for positions she hadn't even applied for, unwilling to hire someone who had become the center of controversy. The damage to her career prospects extended far beyond Riverside Elementary. Board member Patricia Wells spoke up, her voice defensive. "Mr. Martinez, surely you understand that we had legitimate concerns about community acceptance of Ms. Chian's background. We were responding to parent complaints about her suitability for the position." Martinez smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Ms. Wells, You're referring to complaints from one parent, Marcus Sterling, whose nephew's life was saved by my client's quick thinking and military training. The same training you've characterized as making her dangerous to children. The irony of the situation had become impossible to ignore. The military skills that Sterling had used to paint Sarah as a threat were exactly what had enabled her to save his nephew's life. The board had allowed themselves to be manipulated by inflammatory rhetoric without conducting any independent investigation of the facts. Mr. Martinez, Davies said, clearly trying to find a way to end the meeting without further damage. What would your client require to resolve this situation amicably? Sarah had spent considerable time thinking about this question over the past few days. Simply returning to her position wouldn't address the broader issues that had been raised, nor would it prevent similar situations from occurring to other veterans in the future. My client has several requirements, Martinez said, consulting his notes. First, a formal apology from the board acknowledging that their initial decision was based on incomplete information and discriminatory assumptions about military veterans. Second, a written policy statement affirming the district's commitment to supporting veteran employees and prohibiting discrimination based on military service. The demands were reasonable, but Sarah could see that Davies was struggling with the public relations implications of a formal apology. Admitting error would confirm that the board had acted improperly, potentially strengthening any legal claims against the district. Third, Martinez continued, compensation for lost wages, emotional distress, and damage to professional reputation. And fourth, a commitment to diversity training for board members and district administrators regarding veteran employment issues. The financial implications of the settlement were clearly weighing on the board members' minds. Sarah's case had already generated negative publicity that would be expensive to overcome, and a protracted legal battle would only make the situation worse. Davies called for a brief recess, and the board members huddled in urgent consultation with their legal counsel. Sarah could hear fragments of their whispered conversation, discussions about insurance coverage and potential jury awards that suggested they were beginning to understand the full scope of their liability. When the meeting resumed, Davies looked like a man who had aged years in the span of 20 minutes. Ms. Chun, the board is prepared to meet your requirements, contingent upon a comprehensive settlement agreement that resolves all potential claims against the district. Sarah felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. She had won the battle to restore her position and protect her reputation, but the cost had been enormous. The past month had taken a toll on her physically and emotionally, and the trust she had felt in her community had been permanently damaged. There's one more thing, Sarah said, speaking directly to the board for the first time since the crisis began. I want to establish a scholarship fund for children of military families, funded by the district and administered through the school foundation. Too many military families struggle with educational expenses, and their children deserve support from the communities their parents have served. The request caught the board members off guard, clearly not expecting Sarah to use her victory to benefit others rather than herself. Davies nodded slowly, recognizing that supporting military families would help repair the district's relationship with the veteran community. We can work with that, Davies said quietly. Is there anything else? Sarah thought about all the things she could demand, all the ways she could make the board pay for what they had put her through, but revenge wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to ensure that no other veteran would face the kind of discrimination she had experienced, and she wanted to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by the entire ordeal. I want to return to work immediately, she said simply. The children need their nurse, and I need to get back to doing what I love. The settlement was finalized within a week, and Sarah returned to Riverside Elementary on a crisp November morning that felt like a new beginning. The hallways were decorated with welcome back signs created by students, and she found her office filled with flowers and cards from parents expressing their gratitude and support. Emma Rodriguez was her first patient of the day, coming in for her routine blood sugar check. The little girl hugged Sarah tightly, expressing the simple joy that children feel when trusted adults return to their lives. There were no complicated explanations needed, no discussions of discrimination or legal settlements. Sarah was back, and that was all that mattered to Emma. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of students visited the nurse's office, many of them clearly making excuses just to see Sarah and confirm that she was really back. Teachers stopped by between classes to express their support and share stories of how they had missed her expertise during her absence. The most meaningful visit came just before lunch, when Tyler Sterling appeared at her door with his mother. Mrs. Sterling looked nervous, clearly uncertain about how Sarah would receive them, given everything that had happened with Tyler's uncle. "Miss Chun," Mrs. Sterling said quietly, "Tyler has something he wants to give you." The boy stepped forward and handed Sarah a drawing he had made, a crayon picture showing Sarah in her school nurse uniform with the words, "My hero," written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Tyler looked up at her with the kind of pure admiration that children reserve for adults who have shown them kindness in their time of need. "Thank you for saving my life," Tyler said simply, then hugged her legs before running back to his classroom. Mrs. Sterling remained behind, tears in her eyes. "Miss Chun, I'm so sorry for what my brother-in-law put you through. Tyler talks about you constantly, about how brave you were and how you made him feel safe when he couldn't breathe. I should have spoken up sooner." Sarah understood the difficult position Mrs. Sterling had been in, caught between family loyalty and her recognition of the truth. "Tyler is a wonderful boy," Sarah said gently. "I'm just glad he's healthy and happy." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Davies, who looked more uncomfortable than Sarah had ever seen him. The past month had clearly taken a toll on him as well, and he seemed to have aged considerably since their first confrontation in the board meeting. "Sarah," he said formally, "I wanted to personally apologize for the way this situation was handled. The board and I made serious errors in judgment, and you paid the price for our mistakes." Sarah appreciated the apology, but she could see that Davies was still struggling with the implications of what had happened. His authority had been publicly challenged, his decision-making had been exposed as flawed, and his relationship with the community had been damaged by the controversy. "Mr. Davies," Sarah said carefully, "I hope we can move forward and focus on what's best for the children. That's all I've ever wanted." Davies nodded, but Sarah could see that their professional relationship would need time to heal. The crisis had revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to leadership and community service, differences that couldn't be resolved with simple apologies. As the weeks passed, Sarah settled back into her routine at Riverside Elementary, but she was aware that something fundamental had changed. The parents who interacted with her now did so with a new understanding of her background and capabilities. Teachers sought her advice not just on medical issues, but on crisis management and emergency preparedness. The community's perception of her had been transformed from that of a quiet school nurse to that of a decorated veteran who had chosen to serve children. The Scholarship Fund for Military Families was officially launched in January, with Sarah serving on the selection committee alongside representatives from local veterans organizations. The first recipients were 3 high school seniors whose parents had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, students who would now be able to attend college with financial support from the community their families had served. Marcus Sterling had quietly withdrawn from public involvement in school district affairs, his credibility damaged by the revelation of how thoroughly he had misrepresented Sarah's background and qualifications. The social media posts that had started the entire controversy were eventually deleted, but screenshots had been preserved by various veterans organizations as examples of the kind of discrimination that military personnel face when transitioning to civilian careers. Colonel Webb became a regular correspondent, checking in on Sarah's progress and sharing her story with other veterans facing similar challenges. The case had attracted national attention from veterans advocacy groups who used it as an example of the need for better education about military service and stronger enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. The most lasting change, however, was in Sarah herself. The experience had forced her to confront aspects of her military service that she had kept hidden, to acknowledge the skills and experiences that made her exceptional at her civilian job. She no longer downplayed her background or apologized for the training that enabled her to excel in emergency situations. During a staff meeting in March, Sarah was asked to present a training session on emergency response procedures for school personnel. As she stood before her colleagues, sharing knowledge gained through military service and refined through years of civilian experience, she realized that she had finally found a way to integrate all aspects of her identity. The key to effective emergency response, she told the assembled teachers and administrators, is remaining calm under pressure and making decisions based on training rather than emotion. Whether you're treating a wounded soldier in Afghanistan or a child having an asthma attack in Connecticut, the principles are the same. Assess the situation quickly, prioritize actions based on severity, and communicate clearly with everyone involved. The presentation was well received, and several teachers approached her afterward to express their appreciation for her expertise. Sarah realized that her military background was no longer something she needed to hide or apologize for. It was an integral part of what made her effective in her civilian role. The spring brought new challenges as Sarah worked with the district to develop updated emergency protocols that incorporated lessons learned from her military experience. The procedures she developed for managing mass casualty events, coordinating with first responders, and maintaining communication during crises became models that other school districts requested permission to adopt. On a warm afternoon in May, Sarah was organizing supplies in her office when she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in Army fatigues knocked on her door, introducing herself as Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a military nurse who was beginning her transition to civilian health care. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Walsh said formally, "I heard about your situation through Colonel Webb. I'm being medically retired next month, and I wanted to ask your advice about finding work as a civilian nurse." Sarah invited the young lieutenant to sit down, recognizing the uncertainty and apprehension in her voice. She remembered her own transition years earlier, the fear of being judged for her military service and the challenge of translating combat experience into civilian qualifications. "The most important thing to remember," Sarah told Lieutenant Walsh, "is that your military training is an asset, not a liability. The skills you've learned in the Army, the ability to function under pressure and make critical decisions quickly, those are exactly what civilian healthcare needs." They talked for over an hour, with Sarah sharing practical advice about resume writing, interview techniques, and the importance of finding mentors in civilian healthcare settings. But more importantly, she shared her own story of triumph over discrimination, of refusing to apologize for the service that had shaped her into an exceptional healthcare provider. "There will be people who don't understand," Sarah said honestly. "There will be those who see your military background as something to overcome rather than something to celebrate. But there will also be patients whose lives you save because of your training, colleagues who respect your expertise, and communities that are better served because you chose to continue serving in a different capacity." Lieutenant Walsh left with tears in her eyes, expressing gratitude not just for the practical advice, but for the hope that Sarah's story provided. As Sarah watched the young veteran walk away, she realized that her experience at Riverside Elementary had become more than just a personal victory. It had become a beacon for other veterans facing similar challenges. The school year ended with Sarah receiving the district's award for excellence in service, a recognition that felt particularly meaningful given the events of the previous year. During the awards ceremony, Superintendent Rodriguez publicly acknowledged Sarah's contributions not just as a nurse, but as an advocate for military families and a bridge between the civilian and veteran communities. Sarah Chun represents the best of what our schools can be, Rodriguez said during her presentation. Speech. She brings to her work not just medical expertise, but a dedication to service that was forged in the crucible of military experience and refined through years of caring for our children. As Sarah accepted the award, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The roadside bomb that had ended her military career, the painful months of rehabilitation, the decision to become a nurse, the years of quiet service at Riverside Elementary, and finally the public battle that had nearly destroyed everything she had built. But standing before an auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and community members who now understood and appreciated her story, Sarah realized that every challenge had been worth it. She had not just survived the attempt to destroy her career. She had emerged stronger and more integrated, no longer hiding parts of herself but embracing the fullness of her experience and identity. The summer brought speaking invitations from veterans organizations, nursing conferences, and educational forums interested in Sarah's perspective on veteran employment issues. She accepted several opportunities to share her story, always emphasizing the importance of supporting military personnel as they transition to civilian careers. During one particularly memorable presentation to a gathering of school administrators, Sarah was asked about the lessons learned from her experience at Riverside Elementary. "The most important lesson," she said, "is that fear and prejudice can only triumph when good people remain silent. My situation was resolved not because I fought back alone, but because others stepped forward to speak the truth about military service and veteran contributions to civilian communities." She paused, looking out at the audience of educational leaders. Every veteran in your schools, whether they're teachers, administrators, or support staff, brings unique skills and perspectives that can benefit your students and your communities. But they can only contribute effectively if they're welcomed and supported, not viewed with suspicion or fear. The presentations led to consulting opportunities with other school districts, seeking to improve their support for veteran employees. Sarah developed training programs for administrators, created resources for veteran teachers and staff, and helped establish mentorship networks that connected military personnel with successful civilian professionals. By the following school year, Sarah had become a regional advocate for veteran employment rights while continuing her work as head nurse at Riverside Elementary. The children she served remained her primary focus, but her influence had expanded to encompass a broader mission of supporting military families and veterans throughout the educational system. The scholarship fund had grown substantially, supported by donations from community members who had been moved by Sarah's story and wanted to demonstrate their appreciation for military service. The first recipients were now thriving in college, their success a testament to the community's commitment to supporting those who had served. Marcus Sterling had moved away from the area, his business suffering from the negative publicity generated by his campaign against Sarah. His departure was largely unnoticed, his absence creating space for more positive voices in the community. Dialogue about military service and veteran contributions. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after the roadside bomb that had changed her life, Sarah stood in her office at Riverside Elementary, looking out at children playing during recess. The familiar sounds of laughter and activity filled the air, reminding her of why she had chosen this path and why the fight to stay had been worth every difficult moment. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Webb, now a regular source of encouragement and professional guidance. The message was simple but meaningful. "Saw the article about your advocacy work in military times. Proud of you, soldier. You're still serving your country, just in a different uniform." Sarah smiled, understanding that her journey from soldier to nurse to advocate represented a natural evolution of her commitment to service. The skills she had learned in combat had found new applications in civilian life, and the challenges she had faced had only strengthened her resolve to help others navigate similar obstacles. As the morning progressed, a steady stream of students visited her office with the usual array of minor injuries and health concerns. Each interaction reminded her of the privilege she had to serve these children, to be trusted with their care and their fears, to provide the kind of steady presence that military training had uniquely prepared her to offer. During lunch, she received a call from Lieutenant Walsh, the young veteran she had mentored months earlier. Walsh had secured a position at a major medical center and was calling to express her gratitude for Sarah's guidance and encouragement. "Ma'am," Walsh said, her voice filled with excitement, "I just wanted you to know that your advice made all the difference. I went into my interviews confident about my military experience instead of apologetic, and it changed everything. They hired me specifically because of my Army training, not despite it." Sarah felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her experience had helped another veteran successfully transition to civilian healthcare. The ripple effects of her victory at Riverside Elementary continued to expand, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways she had never anticipated. As the school year continued, Sarah's story became part of the district's culture, referenced in training sessions and orientation programs, as an example of the value that diverse backgrounds bring to educational settings. New employees learned about the importance of supporting veteran colleagues, and the entire community had gained a deeper appreciation for military service and sacrifice. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the annual Veterans Day Assembly, where Sarah was invited to speak about her military service for the first time since joining the school district. Standing before hundreds of students, teachers, and parents, she shared stories of her deployments and her transition to civilian life, emphasizing the continuity of service that connected her military and nursing careers. "Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform," she told the assembled crowd. "It just takes different forms." Whether the first was protecting soldiers in Afghanistan or caring for students here at Riverside, the mission remains the same: taking care of others and making a positive difference in the world. The response was overwhelming, with students asking thoughtful questions about military life and expressing genuine appreciation for her service. Parents who had once viewed her military background with suspicion now saw it as evidence of her dedication and capability. As Sarah walked back to her office after the assembly, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of acceptance and recognition. The battle she had fought was not just about keeping her job. It was about changing perceptions and creating space for other veterans to serve their communities without shame or apology. The afternoon brought its usual rhythm of scraped knees and stomach aches, routine matters that reminded Sarah of the simple but profound importance of her daily work. Each child she treated represented a family that trusted her with their most precious possession, a responsibility she never took lightly. The winter months brought unexpected challenges that would test Sarah's resilience in ways she hadn't anticipated. A severe flu outbreak swept through Riverside Elementary in February, overwhelming the usual protocols and requiring the kind of crisis management skills that Sarah's military background had uniquely prepared her to handle. The situation began on a Tuesday morning when 17 children reported to her office within the first hour of school, all exhibiting symptoms of high fever, severe congestion, and respiratory distress that went beyond typical seasonal illnesses. Sarah immediately recognized the signs of a potential epidemic and implemented emergency protocols that most school nurses would never have considered. Drawing on her experience managing medical crises in resource-limited environments, she quickly established triage procedures in the gymnasium, converting the space into a temporary medical facility where she could monitor multiple patients simultaneously while maintaining proper isolation protocols. Her military training and logistics proved invaluable as she coordinated with local health authorities, arranged for additional medical supplies, and established communication networks with parents and healthcare providers throughout the district. The systematic approach she applied to the crisis, treating it with the same strategic thinking she had once used in combat medical situations, prevented what could have become a community-wide health emergency. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the county health department's chief epidemiologist, arrived at the school that afternoon to assess the situation and was amazed by the level of organization and control Sarah had established. The temporary medical facility was running with military precision, with clear protocols for patient assessment, parent communication, and medical record keeping that exceeded anything Dr. Harper had seen in civilian emergency responses. "Miss Chun," Dr. Harper said as she observed Sarah coordinating the care of nearly 30 children, while simultaneously briefing substitute teachers on isolation procedures, "where did you learn to manage a medical crisis at this scale?" Sarah paused in her documentation to look up at the health official. "Afghanistan, ma'am. We often had to establish field hospitals with limited resources and treat multiple casualties simultaneously. The principles are the same whether you're dealing with combat injuries or childhood illnesses." Dr. Harper spent the next hour interviewing Sarah about her methods, taking detailed notes on the protocol she had established and the decision-making framework she had applied to the crisis. The health department had been struggling with emergency preparedness in educational settings, and Sarah's approach offered solutions that could be applied throughout the region. The flu outbreak was contained within 48 hours with no serious complications among the affected children and minimal spread to the broader community. Parents who had initially brought their children to Sarah's makeshift medical facility left with profound appreciation for her expertise and the calm authority she had brought to a frightening situation. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter Emma had been among the first children to fall ill, sent a letter to the school board describing her experience during the crisis. Ms. Chun transformed what could have been a panic situation into something manageable and reassuring, she wrote. "Watching her work, I understood for the first time how her military training translates into exactly the kind of healthcare leadership our children deserve." The success of Sarah's crisis management during the flu outbreak led to requests from other school districts seeking her expertise in emergency preparedness. She began consulting with administrators throughout the region, helping them develop protocols for managing medical emergencies that drew on military principles of triage, resource management, and command structure. These consulting opportunities brought Sarah into contact with other military veterans who had transitioned into educational roles, creating an informal network of professionals who supported each other's civilian careers while drawing on their shared military experience. The network grew to include former Army medics working as school nurses, retired Air Force logistics specialists serving as district administrators, and Navy veterans who had become teachers and counselors. The Veterans Network organized regular meetings where members shared strategies for translating military skills into civilian educational settings, discussed challenges they faced in their transitions, and provided mutual support for professional development. Sarah found herself serving as an informal leader of the group, her successful resolution of the discrimination case making her a symbol of what veterans could achieve when their skills were properly recognized and valued. During one particularly meaningful network meeting, Sarah was approached by Captain Maria Santos, a recently retired Marine Corps officer who was struggling to find employment as a high school administrator. Santos had been turned down for several positions, with hiring committees expressing concerns about her military background and whether she could adapt to civilian educational environments. "Sarah," Santos said quietly after the formal meeting had ended, "I keep hearing the same things you must have heard. That military people are too rigid, too authoritarian, that we don't understand how to work with children. How did you overcome those prejudices?" Sarah spent time with Santos, sharing not just practical advice about resume writing and interview techniques, but also the deeper lessons she had learned about presenting military experience as an asset rather than a liability. She helped Santos identify specific examples from her Marine Corps service that demonstrated skills directly applicable to educational leadership, from crisis management to team building to strategic planning. The mentoring relationship with Santos led to similar requests from other veterans, and Sarah found herself developing formal training programs for military personnel transitioning into educational careers. Working with local veterans organizations and community colleges, she created workshops that helped veterans translate their military experience into civilian qualifications and prepare for the unique challenges of working in educational environments. The training programs attracted attention from state education officials, who were struggling with teacher shortages and looking for new sources of qualified candidates. Veterans represented an untapped pool of potential educators, many with advanced technical skills, leadership experience, and dedication to service that aligned perfectly with educational mission requirements. Sarah was invited to present her veteran transition program at the State Education Conference, speaking to an audience of superintendents, principals, and human resources directors about the benefits of recruiting military personnel for educational roles. Her presentation drew on specific examples from her network, including Santos, who had successfully secured a position as an assistant principal and was already being recognized for her innovative approaches to student discipline and campus safety. Veterans don't just bring skills to educational settings, Sarah told the conference audience. They bring a commitment to service that naturally extends to serving students and communities. The same dedication that drives military service drives excellence in civilian careers, but only when we create environments that welcome and support that transition. The conference presentation led to partnerships with several universities that were developing programs specifically designed for veterans entering education. Sarah served on advisory committees that helped design curricula, establish internship programs, and create support networks for military personnel pursuing teaching credentials and administrative certifications. Her involvement in veteran transition programs brought national recognition, including invitations to speak at military transition conferences and write articles for professional publications about veteran employment in educational settings. Sarah found herself becoming a national advocate for veteran teachers and administrators, using her platform to challenge stereotypes and promote policies that supported military personnel in civilian careers. The work was demanding, requiring travel and time away from her primary responsibilities at Riverside Elementary, but Sarah discovered that her advocacy efforts enhanced rather than detracted from her effectiveness as a school nurse. The broader perspective she gained from working with veterans throughout the country brought new insights to her daily practice, and the recognition she received elevated the profile of school nursing as a profession. During the spring of her third-year post-controversy, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The caller introduced himself as Dr. Robert Chun, director of the VA's Veteran Transition Services, who had been following Sarah's work with interest and wanted to discuss potential collaboration on federal veteran employment initiatives. Ms. Chun, Dr. Chun said during their initial conversation, your success in both overcoming employment discrimination and creating programs to help other veterans has caught the attention of policymakers in Washington. We're looking for practitioners who can help us develop better support systems for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The conversation led to Sarah being invited to Washington to participate in a federal task force on veteran employment, focusing specifically on barriers that military personnel face when seeking positions in education, healthcare, and other service-oriented careers. The task force included representatives from multiple federal agencies, veteran service organizations, and civilian employers committed to improving veteran hiring practices. Sarah's contributions to the task force were significant, drawing on Her personal experience with discrimination, as well as her extensive work with other veterans facing similar challenges. She helped develop recommendations for federal policies that would strengthen anti-discrimination protections for veterans, improve transition assistance programs, and create incentives for employers to actively recruit military personnel. The task force work required regular travel to Washington, but Sarah was able to maintain her responsibilities at Riverside Elementary through careful scheduling and the support of colleagues who understood the importance of her advocacy work. Principal Davies, who had grown to deeply respect Sarah's contributions to the school and the broader community, was particularly supportive of her federal involvement. "Sarah," Davies told her during one of their regular meetings, "what you're doing in Washington will benefit not just our school, but educational systems throughout the country. We're proud to support your work and honored that Riverside Elementary can serve as your home base for this important mission." The federal task force published its recommendations in a comprehensive report that received significant media attention and congressional interest. Sarah found herself testifying before House and Senate committees about veteran employment issues, sharing her story and advocating for policy changes that would prevent other veterans from facing the discrimination she had experienced. Her congressional testimony was particularly powerful, combining personal narrative with policy analysis in ways that resonated with legislators from both political parties. Sarah's ability to speak from experience while offering practical solutions made her an effective advocate for veteran employment rights and contributed to bipartisan support for legislative reforms. The policy work led to significant changes in federal veteran transition programs, including new requirements for employer education about veteran skills and capabilities, expanded legal protections against military status discrimination, and increased funding for programs that help veterans translate their military experience into civilian qualifications. Sarah's role in these federal initiatives brought her to the attention of national media, resulting in profiles in major newspapers and appearances on television programs focused on veteran issues. She used these platforms to continue advocating for veteran employment while also highlighting the broader contributions that military personnel make to civilian communities. The media attention created opportunities for Sarah to reach even broader audiences through book deals and speaking engagements, but she remained committed to her primary role as a school nurse at Riverside Elementary. The children she served continued to be her first priority, and she was careful to ensure that her advocacy work enhanced rather than interfered with her daily responsibilities to students and families. Her success in balancing local service with national advocacy made Sarah a role model for other veterans seeking to make broader impacts while maintaining their commitment to direct service. She demonstrated that individual excellence in civilian careers could become a platform for systemic change, inspiring other veterans to see their own professional success as opportunities to benefit the entire military community. The scholarship fund for military families had grown substantially during Sarah's years of advocacy work, supported by donations from individuals and organizations who had been moved by her story and wanted to demonstrate their appreciation for military service. The fund had expanded beyond Riverside Elementary to serve military families throughout the region, providing educational support for hundreds of children whose parents had served in the military. Sarah continued to serve on the scholarship selection committee, taking particular satisfaction in meeting with recipients and hearing about their educational goals and career aspirations. Many of the scholarship recipients were themselves interested in careers in healthcare, education, or public service, creating a new generation of service-oriented professionals who understood the value of military experience and veteran contributions to civilian communities. As Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from combat medic to school nurse to national advocate, she recognized that every challenge had contributed to her growth and effectiveness. The discrimination she had faced at Riverside Elementary painful as it had been, had forced her to articulate the value of military experience in ways that benefited thousands of other veterans. Her story had become more than just a personal victory. It had become a catalyst for systemic change that would protect and support military personnel for generations to come. The legislation she had helped craft, the programs she had developed, and the attitude she had changed would continue to benefit veterans long after her own career had ended. Standing in her office at Riverside Elementary on the anniversary of her return to work, Sarah looked out at children playing during recess and felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the life she had built. She had successfully integrated her military identity with her civilian career, using both aspects of her experience to serve others and create positive change in the world. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller was another veteran seeking advice about transitioning to civilian healthcare, the latest in a continuous stream of military personnel who had heard about Sarah's success and wanted guidance for their own career transitions. As she began the conversation, offering encouragement and practical advice to someone facing challenges similar to those she had overcome, Sarah smiled at the continuity of service that connected all aspects of her life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.